Here we are, Genesis 42 and 43. It's a pretty powerful statement, what's about to happen. There's a few things that I want to address that the biblical authors have left as an undercurrent of the scriptures. Sometimes biblical authors are sophisticated enough to do this. They are inspired partly by what they leave out explicitly in the text to create a meditation cycle. And one of those things is what the reader knows versus what the text says that the character knows. In other words, there's some things that you and I know as we've been reading through the text that the Bible doesn't say that Joseph knows. An incredible example of this is what Joseph does not know regarding his own father. For example, Joseph's initial relationship tension with his father was when Joseph had that dream, remember, about the moon and the stars and moon, sun, and 11 stars bowing down to him. And what did his father, Jacob, also known as Israel, how did he respond? He rebuked him. He rebuked him. So shortly after that, Jacob sends him away. He says, go find out what your brothers are doing. Now, to us, the reader, we know that that was innocent. He was just curious about what Joseph's brothers were doing. But in Joseph's experience, all he knows is he was sent away to his brothers. And then what's the next thing that happened? His brothers take him and throw him in a pit and sell him into slavery. So we know that Jacob, Israel, had nothing to do with that. Does Joseph know that his father had nothing to do with that? He doesn't know. It's not like his brothers are, it's certainly not in the text, that the brothers are like, just so you know, this is all us. Your dad still loves you so much, but we're acting because, no, there's nothing like that in the text. What Joseph does know is that there was no search party. Joseph doesn't know that his father was fooled into thinking that he's been killed and that his father is grieving. All of that the reader knows, but he doesn't know. He knows that his father sent him and nobody came looking for him. So there is undoubtedly a doubt in Joseph's mind, at least the reader is, I think, the authors anticipate that the readers will wonder if there's doubt in Joseph's mind about the love his father might or might not actually have for him, or if he's been fully rejected. Now, this is doubled down in Joseph's experience because remember, he's lifted up by the captain of Pharaoh's guard, Potiphar. And Potiphar becomes like another father figure where Joseph serves him instead of serving his own father and takes care of his household. And then Joseph is falsely accused. And this father figure sends him to prison. So he's got two father figures in his life that have just, dashed his expectations and his hopes, even though initially he's shown favor. And there is one figure who's emerged now as Joseph comes out of the prison that interprets a couple of dreams properly, who now emerges as the father figure who is lifting Joseph up again, putting him in charge of all of Egypt, this powerful ancient kingdom. And that's Pharaoh, the guy with the snake coming out of his hat. This is the new father figure. So maybe Joseph has felt somewhat rejected, certainly by his brothers, but by his family, his natural family. He has felt rejected, certainly, by Potiphar sending him into prison. But he's got a new life now. He's second in charge. He basically runs the whole show. He's got this new adoptive father, if you will, brand new life, wife and kids, everything's great. He can forget the past. And then who shows up? Well, chapter 42. So remember, what has led to Joseph's uplifting is this crisis. There's a famine throughout the land, not just Egypt, but also in Canaan and the whole region. There's a severe famine. No food is growing. But this was anticipated by Joseph, by the Lord through Joseph, interpreting Pharaoh's dream, saying this would happen. So what you're supposed to do is store up some food in the plentiful years so that when the lean years come and the famine hits, there'll be plenty of food. And so Joseph is selling this extra food to others, right? Well, the famine also hit where Joseph's family is. Jacob, also known as Israel, and the brothers, remember them, they've got no food. So verse 1, now Jacob saw that there was grain, there was food in Egypt. And Jacob said to his sons, we're just staring at each other. He said, look, I've heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy for us from that place, so that we may live and not die. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers. Why not? Remember whose son Benjamin is? Remember who Benjamin's mom is? Rachel. This is the only remaining son of Rachel. Because as far as Jacob knows, Joseph says he's dead. So his favored wife, living son, not going to send him. All right. For he said, I'm afraid that harm may happen to him. So the sons of Israel, who's Israel? Jacob, came to buy grain among those who were coming because the famine was in the land of Canaan. All right, so the last time the family went to Egypt was in Genesis chapter 12. This was in Abraham. He went down to Egypt because of what? A famine. So what happened there is Abram went down and he's like, Sarah, you're kind of pretty, so let's just say you're my sister, because you kind of are. You're, kind of. And deceived Pharaoh. And what resulted from that, because Pharaoh took Sarah into his harem, didn't have sex with her, but she was in line to have sex with him. And so Egypt was hit with this plague. And when Pharaoh figured out what was going on, he's like, get out of here, just leave. And you can take a whole bunch of stuff with you. I'm going to give you some gold, some silver, some animals, and some slaves. And one of those female slaves became a problem and was oppressed by Abram and Sarah. And so Joseph is now living out the reversal of that oppression. So just keep that in mind. The going down to Egypt thing is already well embedded in the ancient Torah reader's mind. What's going to happen when they go back down to Egypt because of the famine? Verse 6. Now Joseph, just to remind you, in case you don't remember from last week, now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold grain to all the people of the land. Just a reminder, this is coming up in a future week, but did he give the grain away? No, he sold it. This is going to become an important feature later in the story. And Joseph's brothers came, and interestingly, they bowed down to him, faces to the ground. And when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them. But he disguised himself to them and spoke to them harshly. He said to them, "Where have you come from?" And they said, "Well, from the land of Canaan to buy food." Remember that dream that Joseph had at the very beginning, Genesis chapter 37, when we started his story? Had this dream about their sheaves bowing down to his sheaf. Remember that? Sheaves of grain. Guess what has just happened? We just see a fulfillment. Not in the way anyone was expecting, but we see a fulfillment of that dream. Just interesting. And note that he said, we can't pass this over without noting, that Joseph disguised himself. This seems to be a little bit of a family trait, doesn't it? Do you remember when Jacob was pretending to be Esau and he disguised himself with his mom's help? Remember that? Do you remember Laban, good old Uncle Laban, disguising Leah so that Leah is actually the first one that Jacob married instead of he was expecting to marry Rachel? Remember that? This whole disguise theme comes up again and again. And Joseph is now disguising himself before his brothers. Is it good? Is it evil? This is not the point of the text here necessarily, is to try to make a moral judgment on him disguising himself. But it is intentionally in there, because the biblical authors don't have to give us this detail. They give us this detail partly to bring our minds back to, oh yeah, the whole masquerade thing. We're in for another masquerade story, except this one lasts a very long time. So, verse 8. Joseph had recognized his brothers, although they did not recognize him. Why are the biblical authors spelling this out? Because it's key to understanding the rest of the story. Usually the biblical authors don't spell things out like this. When they do, it's because it's really important for us to understand the rest of the story. Verse 9, and Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them. What were those dreams? Bowing down to him. And he said to them, "You're spies. You've come to look at the undefended parts of our land." And they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We're all sons of one man. We're honest men. Your servants are not spies." Yet he said to them, "No, you've come to look at the undefended parts of our land." But they said, your servants are 12 brothers, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. And behold, the youngest is with our father today, and one is no longer alive. And Joseph said to them, "Like I said, you're spies. By this you'll be tested, by the life of Pharaoh. You will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. So send one of you and have him get your brother while you remain confined, so that your words may be tested whether there's truth in you. But if not, by the life of Pharaoh, you are certainly spies." So he put them all together in prison for how long? 3 days. I wonder if that's significant. So I want you to notice how this starts out. He hears them say, well, we got one brother up with her dad. The other brother, he's dead. And Joseph knows that dead brother is not dead. Or maybe Benjamin's dead and they're lying and saying that he's with their father. You see what I'm saying? He doesn't know what they're getting at here exactly. So what he decides to do is put all of them in prison. And he said, you can send one among you to go get your other brother, supposed other brother, and bring him. That's how it starts. Watch this turn around very quickly. So remember how Joseph landed where he's landed and the different pits that he landed in? False accusations. false accusations. That's what landed him in prison in the first place. So now he is hitting them with a false, he knows they're not spies, right? He knows that. So he's hitting them with a false accusation as a 3-day test. It's a 3-day test. Verse 18. Now Joseph said to them on the third day motif, do this and live. So he's giving them something to bring life to them on the third day. And this is persistent theme throughout what we call the Old Testament, is something coming alive on the third day. Anyway, for I fear Elohim. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in your prison, but as for you, go carry grain for the famine in your households. Bring your youngest brother to me so that your words may be verified and you will not die. So remember at first, all of you are in prison, send one. Now it's pick one and the rest of you can go. And not only that, you can go and bring grain so that your households will live. This is a huge reversal of what initially in his shock and anger Joseph was going to do. All right. So, but he's basically saying, in trade, you bring your youngest brother here and I'll give you food so that y'all can survive. I'll give you something. So so what did the brothers do 22 years ago to him? They traded him for cash. And then they ate a meal. Actually, I think they ate the meal while Joseph was still in the pit. So now Joseph is doing this. Oh, you want grain? Fine, we'll make a trade. We'll hold a hostage here until you bring the little brother to me. So they did so. Then they said to one another, truly, now this is not them speaking to Joseph, this is them speaking to each other. Truly, we are guilty concerning our brother because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us. Yet we would not listen. And for that reason, this distress has happened to us. Reuben answered them, saying, didn't I tell you, don't sin against the boy, and you wouldn't listen? Now, his blood is required. So, first of all, we get a detail here that the authors chose not to give us and chose to leave out back in chapter 37. What was Joseph's own response when he was thrown in the pit? From the memories of the brothers, it's very clear in their memories, he was pleading with them. This teenage boy who doesn't know if he's going to be killed, in fact, that was the original plan, is pleading with his own brothers. It's echoing in their minds. So why are they talking to each other about this in front of this Egyptian ruler? Because they don't know that the Egyptian ruler, who they also don't know he's their brother, they don't know he can understand them. He's Egyptian. He's not speaking their language of Canaan, this early form of Hebrew. They figure he doesn't know what they're saying. And then Reuben, he jumps in. Reuben, what a guy, okay? Stressful situations. I told you guys so. Reuben that disappeared when the slave trafficking took place and then came back because he had this plan to deceive his brothers by saving Joseph and so forth. And nothing Reuben does ever seems to work out, the oldest. We're going to see Reuben highlighted another time tonight, and it's not pretty. But what he is doing is he's like, I told you so. Verse 23. They didn't know that Joseph understood, meaning what we just read, they're talking to each other, for there was an interpreter between them. Why was there an interpreter? It was part of the masquerade. You see, Joseph has this interpreter, going back and forth with the language of Egypt versus the language of the Canaanites. So that's why the brothers felt like they could kind of talk to each other. Hey, this is because. But he understands every word they're saying. Verse 24. So he, being Joseph, turned away from them and wept. Why is he weeping? Look what he just learned for the first time. He learned that he's still on the mind of his brothers who did this thing 22 years ago, and that they're in distress about it. And they remember his pleading. They brought it back to Joseph's mind, his pleading. This is a remorse on their part, and this hits him emotionally. I think one of the reasons that the biblical authors left some of this information about Joseph's pleading until this point in the narrative is so that we would be hit with the emotion of it, so that we're immersed in the story, and when we see that Joseph is hit with the emotion of it and he turns and he weeps, we're kind of there with him. So Joseph, everything's in threes in the Joseph story. Have you noticed that? 3 pairs of things, 3 days, there's a lot of threes. 3 changes of garments. There are 3 descents in the pit, 3 ascents. There are 3 outbursts of tears in the narrative. This is number 1. The first outburst of tears that he has is when he hears them talking about how they mistreated their younger brother, and that's why this distress is coming upon them. And these 3 outbursts of tears are all part of this reconciliation arc in the story. All right, verse 26. So they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed from there. But when one opened his sack to give his donkey feed at the overnight campsite, he saw his money. Look, it was in the opening of his sack. So he said to his brothers, my money's been returned. Look, here it is, right in the sack. Then their hearts sank, and they trembling to one another, saying, what is this that Elohim has done to us? So the idea is they've gone to this powerful kingdom, seen this very powerful man, very, very powerful man, and they've done a transaction, in all honesty, giving him money so that they can get grain. And they were accused of being spies, thrown in prison for 3 days. They've got their brother's a hostage. I mean, it's a mess. And somehow or the other, their money ended up back in their sacks. So what could they be falsely accused of? Yeah, stealing the grain, not paying for it. So they're kind of freaking out. So this is an image, I think. I think Joseph's sending a message that they stole his freedom and his membership in the family in exchange for cash 22 years ago. So they don't want to be seen as thieves from this mighty man in Egypt. They don't know it's Joseph. But they are thieves because they stole their brother and his life. They are thieves. Verse 29. So when they came to their father Jacob, Israel, in the land of Canaan, they told him everything that had happened to them, saying, the man, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly with us and took us for spies of the country. But we said to him, we're honest men, we're not spies. We're 12 brothers, sons of our father. One's no longer alive. And the youngest is with our father today in the land of Canaan. But the man, the Lord of the land, said to us, by this I will know that you're honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me. Take for the famine of your households. Go. But bring your youngest brother to me, that I may know that you're not spies, but honest men. And I'll give your brother to you, and you may trade in the land. Now it came about as they were emptying their sacks, that behold, every man's bag of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw their bags of money, they were afraid. And their father, Jacob, said to them, you have deprived me of my sons. Joseph is gone. And Simeon is gone. This is the one they left with Joseph. And now you take Benjamin? Everything's against me. Okay, so this is quite a story that they've told them. They're meeting this powerful Lord in Egypt, and all this crazy stuff has happened. What is going on? And who's Jacob thinking of? Himself. This is like classic Jacob. His concern is for himself, his feelings, his own losses, and he's blame casting. I know that the biblical narrative does not cast Jacob in a very pleasant light. And this is super intentional. Remember that the biblical authors themselves are descendants of this guy. This is their founder, okay? It is so incredibly strange of any culture, but especially in the ancient world, to critique your founder like this. The reason that they're doing so, not only is it because it actually happened that way, but the reason that they're highlighting the flaws in their founders so much is to present a critique of Israel as a nation going forward. The biblical authors of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, were not in the majority opinion as far as Yahweh worship at the time that they were writing, other than for a period after the deliverance from Egypt. For the most part of Israel's history, the big majority of people there worshiped other gods. They might have thrown Yahweh in there, but they were not Yahweh faithful. And why? How do I know this? Because you just read it, right? I mean, it says it pretty explicitly. The prophets and the authors of Scripture were a minority report. So they're constantly critiquing their own people. But interestingly, that doesn't mean to them that their own people, the descendants of Israel himself, as the nation of Israel, is without hope. They believe that in spite of these tremendous flaws and deceptiveness and lack of faithfulness and so forth, that God is going to continue to be generous to them. We'll see that actually coming up shortly. Verse 37. Oh, so here's Reuben's solution. He steps in. Reuben, what a guy. Oldest brother. He's the one that the ancient expectation would be. He's the one who's going to bring salvation to the family. He's going to be the one that take over the reins. He'll be the chosen one in the family. Why? Because he's the oldest. Okay, maybe he slept with his father's wife, one of them, Bilhah, Rachel's mom, as a power play against his father. That's, there might have been lust involved, but the whole idea is it's a power play. It's like I'm in charge. Maybe his so-called plan to rescue Joseph was a complete failure, but now it's his turn to step up and offer a solution to this crisis, which is that they can't get any more food or rescue Simeon without bringing Benjamin, and they got to convince their father somehow to let him go. Listen to his solution. Reuben spoke to his father saying, you could put my two sons to death if I don't bring him, meaning Benjamin, back to you. Put him in my care. I'll return him to you. Isn't that noble? Jacob, you can kill your grandsons if I don't fulfill. It's crazy. Does this remind you of anything in Genesis that's happened already? Someone offering their children to die so that this is what Lot did. Remember? The Sodomites were trying to get in so that they could rape the angels. And Lot, who's like, oh, these are my guests. I gotta protect them. So here, you can have my daughters. It's horrifying. And this is the tack that Reuben takes. Jacob doesn't even really respond to the offer. He just says, my son, meaning Benjamin, will not go down with you, for his brother is dead, Joseph, he thinks, and he alone's left. If harm should happen to him on the journey you're taking, then you'll bring my gray hair down to Sheol, which is the place of the dead, in sorrow. In sorrow. So, he doesn't address what Reuben said, but he does say that I've only got one son left. Notice that he's got like 11 sons standing around. He's like, the only one I have left is Benjamin. So no, you can't take him. This is dysfunctional, isn't it? On so many levels. We're going to get to a turning point like now. Chapter 43. Now the famine was severe in the land. Just a reminder, famine means there's no food growing. So it came about when they finished eating the grain which they had brought from Egypt, that their father, this is Jacob, says to them, go back and buy us a little food. So the food did not last through the famine. And Jacob's like, you guys go back. He's willing to risk the lives of his 10 sons here. Not Benjamin, but he's willing to risk all the other sons. And Judah spoke to him, however, saying, the man sternly warned us, you shall not see my face unless your brother's with you. If you send our brother with us, then we'll go and buy you food. But if you don't, we're not going down. Well, the man said to us, you're not going to see my face unless your brother's with you. This is a refusal that they're not going to go unless Benjamin goes with them. Just remember, we're not supposed to go back unless we bring the brother. Then Israel said, Israel being Jacob, why did you treat me so badly? By telling the man whether you still had another brother. But they said, this is the brothers, the man specifically asked about us and our relatives, saying, is your father still alive? Have you another brother? So we answered his questions. Could we possibly know that he would say, bring your brother down? A couple things to notice in this little passage is where does Jacob go again with his anger? Is still how it affects him personally. This is a repeated theme. But do you remember in reading the account so far where Joseph said, do you have another brother? It's not there. It's a little ambiguous as to whether the brothers are making this part up as an excuse. It's a little ambiguous. It could be that they're just making that part up. So, verse 8. So Judah said to his father Israel, send the boy with me, and we will arise and go so that we may live, not die, as well as you and our little ones. Verse 9 is one of the most important verses in the entire Bible. The next verse. Remember Reuben's plan? Reuben's plan was, send Benjamin with me, and you can kill my sons if we don't come back with Benjamin. This is Judah's plan. Now, Judah has not been cast in a super favorable light either up until now. You remember Judah was the one that's like, let's not kill the boy. What profit is there? And let's sell him as a slave. And then in the next chapter, we've got him not fulfilling the right of a father-in-law when a son dies and the wife is left without a husband. Well, marries the second husband. The second husband's like, I'm not going to have a kid with you because it'll be my brother's kid. Lord kills him. Third son, Judah's like, yeah, I don't think you're going to marry the third son, but well, I'll say he's too young, deceives her, so she deceives him, right? It's just a horrific story in Genesis chapter 38. Sleeps with him, he thinks she's a prostitute, takes a couple of his, takes his ID, and then later, he doesn't get his ID back. He's like, oh, what the deal is with that prostitute. And then when she turns up pregnant, he's like, burn her. Burn the lady. She must have had sex with somebody, outside of marriage. And then when she says, yep, and here's the one I had sex with, and gives him his ID back. This is the first time we see a glimmer of hope for Judah, because he's like, you know what? You're more righteous than I am. You're more righteous than I am. A little bit of self-reflection that happens there. So that's the first glimmer of hope we have for him. This is the next one. And actually, I think it's next week, we get the big Judah moment. But this is the secondary one. The progression that Judah has gone through is profound, because he's saying, nope, verse 9, I myself will take responsibility for him. You may demand him back from me, and if I do not bring him back to you and present him to you, you can let me take the blame forever. He's willing to shoulder the blame, even if it's not his fault. This is messianic. This is why Judah is the elect one, because of his willingness to take on something that he doesn't even deserve, to carry the blame on his own shoulders. Don't believe me? Wait till next week. For if we had not delayed, surely by now we could have returned twice. Big shift. All right, verse 11. Then their father Israel said to them, if so, all right, then do this. Take some of the best products of the land in your bags, carry down to the man as a gift. A little balsam, little honey, labdanum, resin, myrrh, pistachio nut. I love pistachio nuts. That's just a little commentary from your teacher. Pistachios. Is there any better ice cream on the planet than pistachio ice cream? It's just, and almonds. Oh, I wonder if it was marzipan. Also the best candy on the planet. At any rate. And double money in your hand. And take back in your hand the money that was returned in the opening of your sacks. Maybe it was a mistake. And take your brother also. Rise, return to the man. May God Almighty grant you compassion in the sight of the man, that he'll release to you your other brother, that guy, what was his name? Oh yeah, Simeon. He doesn't even say his name, it's just like so. And Benjamin, he says his name. As for me, if I'm bereaved of my sons, I'm bereaved. So the men took this gift, and they took double money in their hand, and Benjamin. And they set out, went down to Egypt, and stood before Joseph. So all these verses have been taken up with dialogue, right? There's a lot of dialogue here. And then the whole journey from Canaan down to Egypt, which surely took, weeks and lots of adventures, it just skips over entirely. This is classic biblical authors do this. If it's not crucial to the story, they don't add any fluff. That's very unlike modern novels, which is like, of course, you want to know the transition. It's kind of like in movies or shows you watch, where there's a transition from one location to another. You just see the plane taking off and then the plane landing, right? Or just the plane. You notice that? I don't know if you know. That's like a technique that filmographers use. Well, here in the Bible, it's just, and suddenly they're before Joseph. So the gift thing. Remember how Jacob used gifts, or tried to use gifts, to soften Esau's wrath several weeks ago, when he's returning to the land of Canaan, and after stealing the birthright and stealing the blessing from his brother Esau, and he knows Esau's coming. And so he sends all these lavish gifts ahead. So this appears to be one of Israel's strategies, which is to forestall any kind of enmity by sending a bunch of gifts, bribes, which is something that Israel as a nation ended up doing much later with other powerful kingdoms. Rather than relying on the Almighty, it's almost like a type of bribe. So this is something that Jacob just has done before, and he's doing again. Verse 16. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, it's been 22 years. Benjamin was quite likely a very young child, or, very young child, the last time that Joseph saw him. He sees him 22 years later as a fully grown man. He said to his house steward, "Bring the men into the house. Slaughter an animal, make preparations, for the men are going to dine with me at noon." To the reader who's been reading carefully about all these meals and so forth, what kind of meal is this going to be? Is this going to be a reconciling meal? There have been reconciling meals in the narrative. We had that reconciling meal that Melchizedek gave to Abram and his people and people that weren't his people. We've had a reconciling meal with Laban and Jacob, a reconciling meal with Abimelech and Isaac. Is it going to be one of those? Or is it going to be like one of those reversals of, you remember that meal you had when I was in the pit pleading for my life? Yeah, well, we're going to have one kind of like that. Which is it? Verse 17. So the man did as Joseph said and brought the men to Joseph's house. Now the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, this being the brothers. And they said, "It's because of the money that was returned in our sacks the first time that we're being brought in, so that he can attack us and overpower us and take us as slaves with our," I'm so tempted to use the King James word here for donkeys, if you know what that is. Yeah, he's going to own our donkeys. So remember that the residence is also, like in Potiphar's case, it's also where the prisoners are kept, if it's a lavish residence. So they approached Joseph's house steward and spoke to him at the entrance of the house and said, "My lord, we came down the first time to buy food, and it happened when we came to the campsite. We opened our sacks, and look, each man's money was in the opening of our sack, our money in full. So we brought it back in hand. And we've also brought down other money in our hand to buy food. We don't know who put the money in our sacks." But he, meaning the steward, said, "Shalom. Don't be afraid. Your Elohim, your God, and the Elohim of your father has just given you treasure in your sacks. Your money was in my possession." These biblical authors are off the chart brilliant. They have this pagan Egyptian worshiper of false gods schooling the Israelites on the nature of the fact that God works behind the scenes and that they can trust him. Isn't that crazy? But this is what they do. The biblical authors are inspired to do this time and time again. Reverse our expectations. Cause us to sit back and say, you know what? Can't I trust God as much as I'm being told to by this pagan Egyptian? God's at work. And it's also kind of a wink to the reader. What's happening in this whole story is behind the scenes, God is at work. So then he, this is the steward, brought Simeon out to them. And then the man brought the men into Joseph's house and gave them water, and they washed their feet. And he gave their donkeys feed, so they prepared the gift for Joseph's arrival at noon. for they had heard that they were to eat a meal there. I just want to point out that as the brothers are washing their feet, this is, in effect, the steward giving them an opportunity to wash feet. That right before this reuniting meal with family is the tribes of Israel, the 11 that live at any rate, they have their feet washed. Just pointing it out. It's an interesting little detail, isn't it? Verse 26. Can you think of another time, to make it explicit, in the scriptures where some folks that are problematic have their feet washed at an important meal? Yeah. So the readers of the New Testament, when they are reading about Jesus washing the disciples' feet, it is very likely that the fully catechized Jewish readers of that are reminiscing about this. I wonder if it was there all along. Verse 26, when Joseph came home, they brought into the house to him the gift which was in their hand. They bowed down to the ground before him, and he asked them about their welfare and said, is your old father well, of whom you spoke? Is he still alive? Remember what I said at the beginning of this class about the ambiguity in the text as to whether Joseph knows if his father was for him or against him. He wouldn't know. So he's starting to ask about his father. They said, oh, your servant, our father, is well. He's still alive. They bow down again in homage. Second dream. And he raised his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. He said, is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? They said, may God, and then he said to this younger brother, Benjamin, may God be gracious to you, my son. And he hurried out, for he was deeply stirred over his brother and looked for a place to weep. Entered his chamber, he wept there. The second weeping. Now, the brothers, they're still in this state of, oh, what's going to happen to us? And where did he go? What's going on? Benjamin is Joseph's only full brother. In other words, the only other son of his mother, who is Rachel. And seeing his face, it's the only way he can see a reflection of his own mother. May God be gracious to you, my son. I think that this is also an insertion of the authors that means more than just the statement in history. The message is not just a message to Benjamin in this moment in time. It is. But I think it's a message for all of Israel. This dysfunctional and deceptive family of Jacob that we've been reading about, God's going to be gracious to this family. He just is. They're going to be redeemed. How are they going to be redeemed? In the Joseph narrative, they're going to be redeemed through the unjust suffering of the one that they cast into the pit. How is Israel as a nation going to be redeemed? By the unjust suffering of the one that they cast into the pit. The one that they killed. This is the redemption of Israel in miniature. Verse 31. Then he washed his face, came out, controlled himself, said, serve the meal. They served him by himself and Joseph's brothers by themselves. So there's a separation here because Egyptians aren't going to be eating with Canaanite shepherds, lowly people. And the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat bread with the Hebrews. That's an abomination, the Egyptians. You don't share a table with those people. Now they were seated before him. From the firstborn according to his birthright to the youngest according to his youth. So in other words, Joseph ordered them in order of birth when he seated them. And they looked at one another in astonishment. It's like, how does he even know which one's oldest and which one's young? That's astonishing. Then he took portions to them from his own table. Here, you can have this, you can have this. But Benjamin, he gave 5 times the portion of the rest of them. So they're having this meal, but they're not fully together. You see, the authors are making very clear. They're separate. They're eating, but there's a separation. They're not reconciled yet. But notice how the greatest portion goes to the youngest, how the least is the greatest. Jesus presents this principle fully, obviously, in the New Testament. Makes a big deal out of this. The last shall be first. The greatest among you shall be the servant of all. But this begins in Genesis, where the least gets the most favored. And this is shocking to the ancient reader. To you and I in our culture, it's not shocking because, well, it's his full brother. Of course he's going to give him the most. But to the ancient reader, this is, you don't do that. You don't give more to the youngest. It's almost immoral. And yet, here we're having this principle is, hey, you want to be the greatest in Yahweh's way of doing things? Be the least.